The previous pattern relied on software isolation, but there's another related pattern that uses hardware isolation and brings some additional advantages. The pattern is a low-SIL doer-checker hardware pair. The hardware is a primary CPU plus a checker CPU, so there's two CPUs represented by the two solid boxes. In the automotive industry, this is called an eQuizer pattern, but it's important to realize it only works as advertised if the checker can actually look at the inputs and the outputs from the primary. There are some eQuizers that just look at the internals of the primary without looking at the I/O, and those are much less effective because they cannot tell when the primary is lying to the checker. The software is divided into two parts. There's a low-SIL doer and there's a low-SIL checker, but the doer can be at SIL 1 while the checker can be at SIL 2. And as long as the checker is looking at the inputs and outputs, that can provide a SIL 2 level of integrity for the entire system. The big pro for this pattern is that hardware isolation between the doer and the checker gives you some significant advantages. As mentioned, you can have a SIL 1 doer and a SIL 2 checker, and the SIL 2 checker can keep the system safe. You can also lock down the checker because it's in a different CPU, and once you certify the SIL 2 software in the checker, never change it. Meanwhile, you can do pretty much whatever you want to the SIL 1 software in the doer because the hardware isolation gives you a strong argument that the SIL 1 doer cannot interfere with the SIL 2 checker's safety. An additional significant potential advantage is that you can use different operating systems in the doer and the checker. The doer might be a desktop operating system, and it might be vulnerable to routine security attacks against it. But if the checker uses a real-time operating system that is less likely to be attacked and has better security, you can argue that even if the SIL 1 doer is compromised, the SIL 2 checker is what's in charge of safety, and so you've reduced your vulnerability to security attacks. There are some cons for this pattern. One of the big ones is that you have to make sure the checker's actually working, because it's just keeping an eye on safety rather than controlling the system. At SIL 2, it's probably adequate to do a self-test on the checker, but it wouldn't hurt to also do a heartbeat check from the low-SIL primary just to make sure the checker's really there. The other big con is that still, this is only suitable for SIL 1 or 2 type systems. And that's because the checker self-test cannot be perfect. So in the worst case, the system can still fail active by having the checker miss an internal fault, and then at some later time having the doer make a mistake because it's not at the high level of safety integrity that you need to guarantee system safety.